Hello, hello, and welcome again to Inner Work for Greater Good. My name is Emily Eldridge. I am your hostess with the mostest. Well, maybe not, but I am your hostess. And I'm the founder of Change Light, the creator of the Change Light system, and I'm all about teaching you inner work and guiding people, my clients and others, through inner work that accelerates your power to really be your best self, light up, make a difference, feel amazing, so that you can really have the greatest impact that you came here to have, and our world can light up with your light. So today, I'm not really sure why I'm discussing this topic. If you've seen my other shows, you'll know that I tend to discuss a topic that it's like, oh, this came up with a client this week, or oh, this came up in my life, or I'm struggling with this, or I realized that, or this other person's struggling with this, or what have you. In this case, it's not like I've been struggling with this. I just popped into my head, which makes me think that somebody needs to hear this. Somebody needs to understand this and recognize this, that this might be going on inside themselves. And you might be that person, or someone you know might be that person, and you can share this episode with them. But anyway, the point is, the topic I want to mention today is what I call, or I don't know, the term came to me, stealth inner critic. And here's the thing, when we talk about the inner critic, people like to talk about the inner critic. First of all, I guarantee you there's probably more than one inner critic inside of you. That's been my experience. We don't all just have one. We usually have multiple. However, there can be one that's louder than the others. But then as we heal that one that's critical, sometimes you can end up with another voice after a while that shows up that's criticizing you. And a lot of times it's a matter of figuring out who is at the root of that voice. Like, who's the one talking and why are they speaking that way? And so typically an inner critic we see as a part that's criticizing you, that's telling you you're not good enough, that's undermining your confidence in yourself, that's making you feel small or unworthy or, hurt and attacking you. And that is typical, right? It's like you see it as like, oh, that part that's saying, you're stupid or you're not good enough. And sometimes we can have an inner critic can actually show up as, basically, it sounds like the voice of our mother or our father or a teacher or what have you, because usually in that case, it's because a part of us has taken on that voice and taken on those behaviors and that attitude and that emotional stance and perspective, and in order to try to control us. So if you've seen my other episodes, you know that what we often call inner critics are typically a type of X power, a type of inner part that I call an inner controller. Why do I call it that? Because its MO is to control you or a part of you. So that's typically, when we talk about an inner critic, it's what I call, or an inner controller is often, an inner critic is often what I would call an inner controller. And it's sort of attacking you or a part of you and saying terrible things. But the truth is, we can have different types of inner controllers, which of course means we can also have different types of inner critics. And sometimes they can show up in ways that may not sort of fit that, stereotypical idea of what an inner critic is. And yet at the same time, they can still have that impact on us, which is undermining our faith in ourselves, making us feel small, making us feel inadequate, making us feel not good enough. And so the one type that comes to mind when I talk about stealth inner critic is this type that you can call it, sort of nickname it, the underminer or the doubter. I had a bunch of these early on when I was first drawing out all these voices inside of me and these parts that were making me feel bad and less than and small and not good enough. And I realized that there were voices inside that were basically had this tone of like, I don't know, it was constantly that kind of refrain of, I'd want to make a decision to do something. I'd want to take an action, and I'd get this feeling, this part that was like, I don't know. Well, but what about this? But what about that? Did you think of this? And so I would call that sort of the inner doubter type of inner critic. And basically it was a part of me, and I've run into this sometimes with others, that in my case, actually, it had taken on one of the voices of my mother. I love you, Mom. You're amazing. And she and I have talked about this a lot, about like how, her parenting, or her sort of, the things she impressed on me growing up, had an impact on what I carry today. And I've had to heal a lot of that stuff. And so she's apologized. We've made up. Everything's great. My mom is amazing. She's brilliant. I've talked about her before. But something she would do that later translated or, transferred into me as this voice of, I don't know, was just, she would always question, are you sure this is right? And I don't know. And it was constantly, it felt, and I obviously internalized it. It wasn't intended this way, but I internalized it as this voice that doubted my choices, my ability to do things, that doubted that I hadn't thought everything through. So it was that constant like, I don't know. And I know I keep repeating that refrain, but that's because I think that's kind of obviously what I think my mother said to me a lot. I don't know, and would question. And in her case, and in most parents' cases and other people's cases, it is well intended. It's not meant to undermine our belief in ourselves, our trust in our truths, our faith in our abilities. It's not intended to do that. And my mother in this case never ever intended that. Yet at the same time, in me, it became internalized as kind of like a kind of stealth inner critic, that it was in this sort of roundabout way criticizing or questioning or undermining my approach, my thoughts, my feelings, my choices, my decisions. And so it felt like an inner critic, because ultimately it was basically the message that it felt like I was sending me and that I was getting was, you're not good enough. You don't know what you're doing. You're not smart enough. You haven't really, really thought everything through, et cetera, et cetera. And so it felt, it had a similar impact of an inner critic, which an inner critic is often meant to try to, make us doubt ourselves or question ourselves, or to attack us so that we'll feel small, so that we will be scared and afraid. Again, that wasn't necessarily my mother's intention in this case. And yet it ended up turning into this kind of criticizing, but in a stealthy way, right? Sort of a backhanded and underhanded and undermining kind of way. One of the intentions of an inner critic, now inner critics can have several different intentions, but two of the main ones that I found are that inner critic can be trying to make you smaller, make you contract, so that you won't step out and risk being criticized or risk, being attacked. But the other way that an inner critic can do that as well is to try to push you and pressure you and, come on, get out there and you can do it, to make you bigger and make you achieve so that you won't feel insecure and small. So my point is that this underminer doubter type is kind of like the first type, where it's sort of kind of pulling you back, sort of making you contract and question yourself. And that, anyway, the point is that can be kind of a stealth type of inner critic. There's another sort of stealth inner critic, and I don't know if it really fits under stealth so much as we can, on the surface, when we hear that voice, we can think it is an inner critic with those kinds of intentions or motivations to either try to get us to, push forward and, be better so that we don't feel sad or small or insecure, or the opposite, can try to hold us back, ultimately trying to control us in some way or another. But there's another type of critical inner voice, and inner critic, whatever, inner voice that's critical, whatever, inner critic, that's actually not a controller necessarily in the classic sense. Instead, it's often a wounded. And when these types of inner critics show up, or inner critic that feels like an inner critic, but it's actually more of a critical wounded, I guess you could say, or a controlling wounded is another way I like to see it, is that it'll say like, well, you're a terrible person and you're awful and you're mean and you're this. And it's like attacking us like an inner critic, would, is say, you're not good enough, and trying to, make us feel badly about ourselves. But when I end up talking to those types of voices inside, when we end up doing the drawing out process with those types, what ends up happening is, it turns out, is actually the voice of an inner child. And the reason why it's attacking is because it's angry at you, it's really upset at you, but ultimately because it wants to get your attention. It wants attention from you. It wants you to like pay attention to its needs and take care of its feelings. And so that's where it's different from a controller. It's a wounded, because ultimately its intention is it's just attacking you to try, it's trying to get you to make better decisions, but ultimately because it's feeling threatened, it's feeling scared, it wants to feel better. So it's more directed towards itself as opposed to an inner controller or critic type, a controlling type inner critic controller that's basically trying to get you to change so that you'll make better decisions, so that you'll, you know, whatever it is that it's trying to get you to do, you know, hold back or push forward or whatever. But an inner critic, voice of an inner critic that's actually a wounded, it's a different, it wants attention for itself. The controller's more focused on you. The wounded is more focused on itself, but it's trying to get you to focus on it to help it not feel so scared or insecure or angry at you for the choices that you're making, you know, to pay more attention to doing things a different way, or to a way that's going to help it feel safe and secure and paid attention to. Now, in that vein, I will say that that kind of inner critical voice has definitely been present within me in the past few weeks as I've been contending with a ginormous inner child in me who's been extremely resistant and angry and sad and helpless and hopeless and all this stuff. And sometimes it's used that critical voice to try to get me to turn around and pay attention to it. Now, of course, that doesn't always work, because what do we want to do when someone's criticizing us? Sometimes we just want to turn away and ignore. And so I've been trying to be like, look, leave me alone, like knock it off, kid. And yet really, though, what it's trying to do is get my attention so that it could convey some really good wisdom for me, and some even slightly like big issue, long-term type stuff to say, if you don't listen to me and you don't honor what I need as well, we're not going to be happy. If I ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And that is where that critical inner child, or inner children in general, but speaking of the critical inner child, you know, that's where, you know, it can be a pretty tough, it can be a pretty tough presence to deal with, especially if you're me and I don't have anybody to do the drawing out process on me. So it's a little bit harder. It takes me a little bit longer than it might take my clients if I was working with you or one of them, you know, to heal that child, the type that I'm struggling with. But anyway, the point is that when we have that if this is a type of inner critic, going back to that stealth inner critic, that may not be attacking or telling you you're not good enough, right? It's not in the classic sense, but it's still having that effect of undermining and creating doubt and causing us to lack a feeling of joy or purpose, or you know, like of trust in ourselves. That's a different kind of stealth inner critic. Okay, so that's going back to that. So anyway, just throwing that out there, you know, do you have this voice inside of you that's like undermining you or constantly doubting? It's usually, its intentions are always good when it comes to these controllers or inner critics, any of these X-powers. I've talked about this before. The intentions are always good, even if the results are not. And so sometimes I want to throw this out here too, that like in my case, mine was like the voice of my mother, or, you know, sort of one of those voices my mother would use with me sometimes growing up, because she was basically trying to get me to make sure I was thinking things through, and to make sure I was really considering all the options and I was really weighing everything. And so the intentions were absolutely good. But in that case, it was my mother's voice. But sometimes it can actually just be a function of your mind. That it's just that analytical part of you that's basically saying, okay, wait, are we thinking this through? Have you really sat down and questioned everything going on here, or have you really looked inside yourself? And so that's where it can actually be very helpful. It's not, or let's put it this way, that's where its intentions, the good intentions, could be, that it's just trying to get you to make sure you've really thought it through. The problem is, though, when it causes us to feel undermined and doubt ourselves and not trust ourselves, etc. Because usually when it's having that effect, it's because it's coming from an anxious, fearful, nervous for you, kind of controlling space, where it's trying to control you or a part of you, or make you, sort of question yourself and question things. All right. So anyway, hope this is helpful. Again, always wanting to help you sort of identify what's going on inside of you and really work through some of that. As always, I teach part of the drawing out process in my free program, changelight.world. community or community.changelight.world, just go to the website, sign up. It's free. The community is free. The course in there is free. I did that at the beginning of this year, or I don't know when I did it, sometime in the last few months, because I really want you and everyone else to be able to experience this work, at least part of it, some really powerful stuff for free, and learn more about, really discover what's going on inside of you and draw it out so that you can feel more happy, free, at peace, and whole. All right, and really make a bigger difference in the world. As always, I hope this is helpful. My name is Emily. Mwah. I love you, and I hope to see you in the community. Otherwise, I will see you next week.